Skanderbeg, the terror of the Ottomans, the soldier of Christ. The prologue. He killed so many of them personally that when he finally died in a bed, which was the only way they were ever going to get him, they dug up his bones and wore them as relics. They thought if they carried a piece of him into battle, some of what he was might transfer. The terror of the Ottomans, the soldier of Christ, the same man. He spent 20 years serving the empire that had taken everything from him. He rose through its ranks, commanded its armies, bled for its sultans, and wore the name they gave him. And then, on a cold November night in 1443, he forged a letter, rode hard through the dark, and planted a flag on a limestone fortress in the Albanian highlands that the Ottomans would never pull down in his lifetime. He was 38 years old. He had been waiting, in one way or another, for 20 years. His name was George Castrioti. The Ottomans called him Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, because they had no other word for what he was in the field. The Albanians called him Skanderbeg. The Pope called him Athleta Christi, champion of Christ. The Ottomans, who finally found his grave after his death, dug up his bones and wore them as talismans. They believed the relics of a man that brave could make them brave too. He never lost a pitched battle. Not one. In 25 years of war against the most powerful military machine in the world, commanding armies that never exceeded 15,000 men against Ottoman forces that numbered into the hundreds of thousands, he won every time they met him. He repelled 13 invasions. He buried 2 sultans' ambitions in the limestone hills of northern Albania. He held the door between the Ottoman East and the Christian West shut by the force of his own person and the Renaissance, the thing that would produce Leonardo and Michelangelo, and the world that descended from them, had room to breathe in part because of what one Albanian warlord did in the mountains above the Adriatic. This is the story of a man with a mental resolution so complete it is almost impossible to explain in ordinary terms. The empire that took him spent 20 years trying to make him something he was not. The faith that formed him never let go, and when the moment came, he chose, not impulsively, not desperately, but with the cold clarity of a man who had been waiting for the right time for a very long time. To understand what he chose and why it mattered, we have to go back to the world that produced him. Part 1. The world before the eagle. The Balkans in the early 15th century were a world in the process of being consumed. Not quickly, not in a single cataclysm, but steadily, systematically, with the grinding patience of an empire that had been expanding for a century and had no reason to stop. The Ottoman state, founded in the northwest corner of Anatolia around 1299 by a warlord named Osman I, had by 1405 already crossed the Bosphorus, conquered most of Thrace, and installed itself as the dominant power from the Danube to the Aegean. What remained of Christian rule in the Balkans was not so much a coherent political order as a collection of principalities, kingdoms, and city-states in various stages of negotiating their own subordination. Some paid tribute, some sent soldiers, some sent sons. The decisive blow had been struck at Kosovo in June of 1389, on a broad field in what is now southern Serbia, where an Ottoman army under Sultan Murad I met a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, Albanian, and Wallachian forces under the Serbian prince Lazar Herbeljanović. Both commanders died on the field. Murad I from an assassin's blade after the battle, Lazar from execution, and both sides claimed victory at one time or another. But the practical result was not ambiguous. The Serbian state that had dominated the Central Balkans for 2 generations was broken. Its successor principalities spent the next half-century in Ottoman vassalage, providing troops, tribute, and hostages to a court in Adrianople. That court kept them obedient through the oldest mechanism available to any empire. It was the permanent threat of what would happen if they stopped. Kosovo was not the end of Christian resistance in the Balkans. It was the moment that defined the terms of the resistance that followed. The crusading coalition at Nicopolis in 1396, French, Hungarian, Burgundian knights marching to break Ottoman power on the Danube, was annihilated. John Hunyadi, who would become the dominant Christian military figure of the mid-15th century and Skanderbeg's most important external ally, was still a generation away from prominence. Between Kosovo and Hunyadi, the trajectory in the Balkans was one direction only. This was the world the Albanian lords had been navigating for 2 generations before Skanderbeg's defection. The Venetians held the coastal cities, Durrës, Shkodra, Lecce, buying loyalty where they could and grinding down whatever resisted them. The Ottomans held the interior and pressed deeper every decade. The Albanian lords in between paid tribute here, made alliances there, occasionally fought, occasionally submitted, constantly calculating the difference between survival and extinction. The Ottoman system for managing this situation was built on several interlocking mechanisms. Each one addressed a different dimension of the same problem: controlling a mountainous, clan-organized, difficult-to-administer highland population that had been fighting everyone who came through the passes for as long as anyone had been keeping records. First came military force, the large-scale campaigns that reduced fortresses, killed or dispersed resistance, and established the empire's physical presence in the territory. Then came the Timar system, the land grants distributed to Ottoman cavalry officers and local lords who accepted incorporation into the imperial structure, creating a class of people with a direct economic interest in Ottoman stability. Then came the Devshirme. The Devshirme, in its formal application to the general Christian peasant population of the Balkans, was a levy of boys taken from their families at intervals and brought into the Ottoman palace and military system. In practice for the Albanian nobility, it worked somewhat differently. The sons of lords went as hostages rather than as random levies. Their departure to the Ottoman court a formalized expression of their family's subject status. The mechanics were simple. The family kept its land, kept its title, continued its local authority in exchange for tribute, military service, and children. The children went east. They were converted, educated, trained, integrated into the imperial machine. Some of them ran the empire. Most of them simply became Ottomans. The genius of the system was that it transformed the problem of local loyalty into an investment. You did not need to garrison every Albanian valley with Anatolian troops. If the boys from those valleys were growing up in the Sultan's palace, speaking Turkish, identified with the imperial system that had given them everything they had. The Devshirme worked for generations. It produced janissary commanders and viziers and governors across the entire Balkan theatre. It produced Skanderbeg, or it almost produced Skanderbeg. Dion Castrioti, Skanderbeg's father, was one of the Highland lords navigating this system. He controlled the territory of Mat and Deborah, vast rivers, narrow passes, limestone ridges running northeast toward what is now the Macedonian border. Not large. He commanded roughly 2,000 horsemen at his peak, but strategically placed, the passes through his territory controlling access between the coastal plain and the interior. He had survived as a prince in a world that swallowed princes by being consistently, quietly clever about which way to lean, an Ottoman vassal paying tribute, occasionally allied with Venice or the Serbian despot, calculating constantly. He was not a great man in the way his son would be. He was a careful man, which in that place and that time was the same thing as a surviving man. The land itself shaped everything about the people who lived on it. The Albanian highlands are not soft country. The central spine runs north to south across the whole region, a series of ridges and valleys that alternate between the Mediterranean coastline, olive trees, limestone outcrops, summer heat that sits in the valleys like something with weight, and the interior where the altitude climbs and the rivers cut through gorges so deep and narrow that an army moving through them can be bottled and destroyed by a force a tenth its size. The summer grazing lands are high and cold. The winter descends fast. The men who grew up in those hills learned early that the terrain was their greatest ally and the greatest obstacle simultaneously, that mobility meant survival, that a man who knew his ground could hold against almost anything. They were not chariot fighters. The hills broke chariots. They were infantry and cavalry in the mountain tradition, fast, adaptable, skilled at the ambush and the quick withdrawal that the country naturally suggested, shaped by their geography into exactly the kind of fighters that would prove most effective against a conventional army trying to reduce them. This was the world George Castrioti was born into, sometime around 1405, almost certainly in the small village of Sina in the Dibera region, the youngest son of Giun Castrioti and his wife Voisava. He had 3 older brothers, Stanisha, Reposh and Kostandin, and 5 sisters. He was, by the reckoning of the time and the place, a minor noble's youngest son, which under ordinary circumstances would have meant a life of limited consequence. The Albanian nobility did not practice strict primogeniture in the Western sense, but the youngest son of a prince with 3 older brothers was not, by default, inheriting much. He might have lived and died in the highland principality of his father, managed a stretch of mountain road, attended a few councils, and been forgotten by everyone outside his valley within a generation. History does not always respect the ordinary circumstances. The Ottoman system for managing vassal princes in the Balkans was called the devshirme in its formal application, though what was practiced on the Albanian nobility was a variation on the same principle. The Sultan required the sons of subject lords as hostages, its olan, inner boys, the term the Ottoman court used for the children of the nobility brought into the palace system. The arrangement was not purely punitive. The sons were educated, trained, converted and absorbed into the imperial machine, and the brightest and most capable of them could rise to positions of genuine power within the Ottoman administration. It was the most sophisticated kind of control available to an empire. Take the people most likely to lead future resistance, turn them into instruments of the state, and return them to their home territories as Ottoman officers loyal to the Sultan rather than to the principality that had produced them. It worked, most of the time. Stanisha, the eldest Castrioti brother, had been the first to go, sent to the Sultan's court in 1409 when Skanderbeg was still very young. He converted, took an Ottoman name, married into a Turkish family, and spent the rest of his life as an Ottoman official, the process having done exactly what it was designed to do. George followed later. The exact date is disputed. The sources say 1415 for a first visit and 1423 for the more permanent arrangement. But what is clear is that somewhere around his 18th year, the youngest Castrioti son found himself at the Ottoman court in Adrianople, the city the Turks called Edirne. It was the former Byzantine provincial capital on the Thracian plain, the city Murad I had chosen as his administrative center before the fall of Constantinople made Constantinople itself the empire's new heart. Adrianople in the 1420s was not a frontier outpost. It was one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean world, a prosperous, administratively sophisticated capital housing the court of a sultan who commanded the most powerful military force between Egypt and the Rhine. The Grand Bazaar, the caravanserais bringing goods from the east, the mosques rising over the flat horizon of Thrace. The palace itself, the Edirne Sarai, set on a bend of the Tunka River, its gardens and courtyards and audience chambers functioning as the political nerve center of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. This was the city that received the Albanian boy. The institution he entered was the Enderun School, the palace academy at the heart of the Ottoman system for training its elite. It was a rigorous place. The curriculum was Arabic, Turkish, Persian, the Quran, mathematics, horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, administration. The boys who passed through it were intended to become the empire's officer class, Sanjak Beys who governed provinces, Beyler Beys who commanded armies, viziers who advised sultans. Many of them, particularly those taken through the devshirme from Christian Balkan families, had been converted to Islam on arrival or shortly after. The empire's formal position was that they were now Muslims, now Turks, now servants of the Sultan and of God as the Ottoman court understood God. What happened inside their heads was, by necessity, a more complicated matter. Here is what we know about what happened inside George Castriotti's head during those years, and here is the honest accounting of it. We do not know everything. The chronicles that survive, primarily Marin Barletti's Historia de Vita et Gestis Skanderbegi, written a generation after his death in 1508 and drawing on testimony from men who had known him. They are hagiography as much as history, shaped by the needs of a Catholic Europe that desperately wanted its Albanian hero to be the man they needed him to be. Barletti has Skanderbeg secretly maintaining his Christian faith throughout the Ottoman years, never truly converted, merely playing a role, his baptismal identity preserved intact beneath the Muslim name and the Ottoman uniform. That is the narrative the Church wanted, but it may very well be true considering the drastic actions he'd take later. What we can say is this: the behavior was real. When Skanderbeg walked back into the cathedral at Krujë in November 1443, he did not walk in as a Muslim who had recently changed his mind. He walked in as a man reaffirming something. The chronicles record him declaring in the cathedral that he was returning to the faith of his baptism, not converting to a new one. The Latin phrase his contemporaries used, revertans ad fidem baptismi sui, has the specific register of restoration rather than conversion. His subsequent behavior across 25 years of resistance points to a man whose relationship with Christianity was not nominal or political. It was something he had carried for a long time and was now ready to use. He signed his letters as Miles Jesu Christi, soldier of Jesus Christ. He allied with the papacy. He refused every Ottoman inducement, including offers of restored lands and Ottoman gold. The most honest position is also the most interesting one. We do not know whether he maintained a secret Christianity in the Ottoman court. We do not know whether he was genuinely Muslim for some period of his youth. Or maybe the truth was some third thing. Maybe he was compartmentalized enough that the external forms meant less to him than whatever had been planted in him as a child in the Albanian highlands before they took him east. What we know is that whatever the Ottomans did to him over 20 years of service, it did not take. Not in the way that mattered. The thing they needed from him, the final erasure of the Albanian and the Christian, and the replacement of both with the Ottoman, never happened. He gave them his service. He did not give them himself. That is the central fact of his life, and it is worth sitting with. His three brothers were not as fortunate. Stanisha, as noted, survived by full submission. He lived and died an Ottoman official, absorbed into the empire. Riposh died in a monastery on Mount Athos around 1431. Constantin's fate is murkier. The sources hinted poison, at deaths that were convenient for an empire that had no use for multiple Castroti heirs who might complicate the property arrangements in Albania. The chronicles are specific about Skanderbeg's awareness of what had happened to his brothers. That word reached him in the Ottoman court about the fate of his family's territory and his family's men, and that this awareness hardened something in him across the long years before he had the position and the moment to act on it. Whether those deaths were murder by Ottoman design or the ordinary attrition of the age is impossible to say at this distance. What matters is that Skanderbeg believed what he believed about them, and that belief became part of the calculation. His father, Gjon Castriotti, died around 1437. The Principality of Castriotti, the territory the family had held for generations, the Mat Valley and the Deborah Highlands, passed by Ottoman administrative fiat, not to George, the surviving son, but to direct Ottoman control. There was nothing extraordinary about this from the empire's perspective. The regional arrangements changed, the tribute arrangements changed, local administration passed to an appointed official. Standard operating procedure for a vassal whose line had run out of useful heirs. The son in Ottoman service had no formal claim. He was, by Ottoman reckoning, an Ottoman officer. His father's land was not his father's land anymore. It was the Sultan's land, administered as the Sultan's interests required. It was the most ordinary injustice of the age. It was also the thing that could not be put away. Part 2. The Making of a Soldier. To understand what Skanderbeg became, you have to understand what the Ottomans made him into. The Enderun system produced exceptional soldiers. That was its whole point. The boys who entered it came from varied backgrounds: Albanian highlands, Serbian valleys, Bulgarian plains, Bosnian mountains, and left it as something uniform. They were literate, multilingual, physically trained to a standard the ordinary levy army of any European kingdom would not have matched, and drilled in the particular tactical doctrines of the Ottoman military machine that had made it the dominant force in the region for a century. They learned Turkish and Arabic, and often several other languages besides. Skanderbeg is recorded as fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Italian, and Slavic, a linguistic range that would serve him with remarkable utility in the diplomatic maneuvering of his later years. They learned the administrative vocabulary of the empire, how provinces were governed, how taxes were collected, how armies were supplied, how the machinery of conquest actually functioned at the level where the decisions were made. This was not incidental. A man who had spent 20 years learning how the Ottoman military thought from the inside was a fundamentally different kind of opponent than a Serbian prince who had fought it from outside. The Enderun school sat within the Topkapi complex in Adrianople, the palace precinct that was the nerve center of the empire before Constantinople fell. The boys who graduated from it did not graduate as common soldiers. They graduated as the empire's officer class, the men who would govern provinces and lead campaigns and serve in the innermost circle of the Sultan's administration. The curriculum ran from early literacy through advanced military science, from basic horsemanship to the command of cavalry formations, from Quranic study through the administrative law that governed the empire's property arrangements. A boy who excelled at Enderun had more genuine opportunity within the Ottoman system than almost anywhere else in the 15th century world. The empire did not care about your blood, it cared about your ability, and it rewarded ability on a scale that most contemporary European states could not match. This is what made the Devshirme both effective and, in the long run, occasionally unstable. It took the most capable young men from subject peoples, gave them real power within the system, and relied on the conversion and the years of service and the identity of the court to replace whatever they had been before they arrived. Mostly it worked. The Janissary Corps, the elite infantry who formed the backbone of the Ottoman army, was built on this principle. The Janissaries were the finest infantry in the world during this period, disciplined and professional in a way that the feudal levies of European kingdoms were not. The Devshirme system produced viziers and commanders and governors who ran the empire with genuine competence and mostly genuine loyalty. It was one of the most sophisticated mechanisms for the absorption of human capital that any pre-modern state ever devised. What it could not guarantee was the interior of the men it processed. It could give them a name and a language and a faith and a uniform and 20 years of service. What it could not reach, or could not always reach, was whatever had been planted before the processing began. George Castrioti entered the system somewhere around 1423, at approximately 18 years old, already formed by the Albanian highlands and the Albanian faith and the Albanian identity that had preceded him. The outer layers were replaced, one by one, in the way the system was designed to replace them. He became Skanderbeg. He wore Ottoman armor and commanded Ottoman cavalry and fought Ottoman wars. He prayed in the Ottoman manner, in the Ottoman language, toward Mecca. He was, in every visible external particular, what the empire needed him to be. He began his military service in the early 1420s, and rose through the ranks with a consistency that the Ottoman records, scattered but real, confirm. He held a timar, the land grant that formed the basis of the Ottoman cavalry system near his father's territory in Albania. That detail itself suggests something about how the empire managed him. Close enough to home to have leverage, integrated enough into the system to seem reliable. He served in campaigns across the Balkans, against the Hungarians, against Serbian holdouts, in the ongoing work of reducing the last significant Christian powers between the Danube and the Aegean. He gained the title of Sipahi, the Ottoman cavalry designation. He was eventually appointed Subashu, a district-level administrative and military governor, and by 1440 he held the rank of Sanjak Bey, governor of the Sanjak of Dibra, one of the administrative units the Ottomans had carved out of what had been, not coincidentally, his father's territory. He was, in other words, governing his own homeland on behalf of the empire that had taken it. That arrangement required a specific kind of compartmentalization that the chronicles do not analyze and probably could not. He was enforcing Ottoman law and collecting Ottoman tribute in the valleys where he had grown up, in the villages where the families who remembered his father lived. The men he administered were men who had known the Castrioti name before there was an Ottoman governor called Skanderbeg. The situation was not unusual for a Devshirm graduate. It was, in fact, one of the intended features of the system, since a local man governing local territory was more efficient than an Anatolian outsider who spoke no Albanian. But the human cost of it, the sustained duality of it, is not something the available sources make simple. The name they gave him, Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander, was not honorary. The sources are consistent on this. The comparison to Alexander the Great came from his commanders, from the men who watched him fight and had no other reference point for what they were seeing. His battlefield record across 20 years of Ottoman service was that of a man who had turned warfare into something close to an art form. The chronicles of his later period describe a fighter who combined physical gifts. He was tall by the standards of the age, powerful, with reflexes that multiple contemporary observers found remarkable, with a tactical intelligence that operated at several levels simultaneously. He thought the way a chess player thinks, several moves ahead, adjusting in real time to what the enemy was doing, exploiting terrain with an instinctive fluency that his opponents consistently failed to counter. The single combat story that survives from this period gives you the best available window into what he was at close quarters. It is preserved in a 17th century German chronicle drawn from earlier sources. It describes a scene at the court of Sultan Murad II when Skanderbeg was around 21 years old, roughly 1426, when a Tartar champion appeared at court, challenging anyone present to fight. The scene, as the chronicle has it, unfolded with everyone at court declining the challenge, the Tartar parading his confidence, the Sultan watching. Then Skanderbeg stepped forward. They stripped to the waist. They were given sabers of equal length and weight. The Tartar struck first. Skanderbeg caught the strike with his left hand, deflecting it rather than blocking it, which is the movement of a trained swordsman, not a brawler, and in the same motion cut the Tartar's throat with the right. The Tartar fell. Skanderbeg severed the head entirely and carried it, still bleeding, to Murad. The story has the texture of legend, the drama, the single decisive exchange, the theatrical conclusion. But the saber technique it describes is accurate. The counter, receiving a blow on the offhand while striking with the weapon hand, is a documented Ottoman and Eastern European fighting method of the period, demanding extraordinary timing and nerve, the kind of movement that requires hundreds of hours of training to make instinctive. And the emotional register of the story, the court watching, the Tartar's confidence, the young Albanian officer's willingness to step forward when no one else would, captures something consistent with everything else recorded about him. He was not cautious in that way. He was brave with the specific quality of a man who has enough confidence in his own ability to remain cold when everyone around him is afraid. His curved sword is preserved today in Vienna, alongside his crested helmet and the straight sword that may have been a gift from the Pope. It is Damascene steel, 121 centimeters long, weighing 3.2 kilograms. That weight, over 7 pounds for a curved blade, tells you something. A sword that heavy is not a duelist's weapon. It is a weapon for a man of exceptional physical strength who understood that the momentum of the blade was itself an argument. His chronicler Dimitra Frengu, who served as his scribe and knew him personally, records that he kept 2 swords in the same scabbard at one point. He also commissioned an Italian master sword maker to produce 3 additional blades, one of which, reportedly able to cut through steel, he sent as a present to the Ottoman Sultan. Whether that last detail is exact or embellished, the underlying truth it represents is clear. He was enough of a swordsman that people told stories about his swords. The helmet they preserved with the swords is fitted with a goat's head crest in gilded bronze, the Castriotti family symbol. It is an emblem that appeared on the family's documents and seals, and would eventually become the basis for the double-headed eagle banner he raised over Krujë. It is a Turkish-influenced design, the helmet itself reflecting the Ottoman military tradition in which he had been trained. That is one of the strange harmonies of his life. The warrior who would spend 25 years fighting the Ottoman Empire fought with weapons and wore armor that were products of the Ottoman military culture that had shaped him. Through the 1430s, he commanded Albanian troops in Ottoman service against Albanian resistance. His father's letter to Venice in 1428, seeking forgiveness because his son George was fighting Christians under the Ottoman banner, is the document that tells you something about what those years were doing to the Castriotti family's reputation and possibly to George's own accounting of himself. In 1432, Albanian nobles led by George Arianiti launched a serious rebellion against Ottoman rule. The young Albanian officer commanding Ottoman forces did not defect. He remained loyal to the Sultan. He fought against men who were, by kinship and culture, his own people. This is the fact that the hagiographic tradition struggles with. The later chronicles try to explain it as calculation, that he was waiting for the right moment, that he was preserving himself for a larger purpose, and that the 20 years of Ottoman service were a long patience before the decisive act. That explanation is probably partly true. It may also be too tidy. He was also, for a substantial portion of those years, a young man who had been formed by the empire and who served it competently and well, who held its administrative appointments and fought its wars and wore its titles. If there was a resistance identity running underneath the surface throughout, it ran deep enough that it produced no observable defection for 20 years, across campaigns in which he fought Christians and put down Albanian rebellions without apparent hesitation. What we can say with confidence is this: the position he held by 1440 gave him the tools. The Sanjak Bey of Dibra was not a Janissary private. He was a provincial governor with military command authority and his own cavalry force drawn from the Albanian population. He had intimate knowledge of the territory and 20 years of accumulated experience in how the Ottoman military operated. The man who would take Krujë in 1443 was not improvising from nothing. He was deploying a 20-year education. The question of what changed, what moved him from patient Ottoman officer to defecting Albanian rebel in the autumn of 1443, has several answers, and they all converged. His father, Gain Castriotti, died around 1437, and the family territory was absorbed directly into Ottoman provincial administration. His brothers were dead or dispersed. Stanisha was absorbed into the empire, Raposh dead in a monastery, Kostandan's fate murky but almost certainly violent. The patrimony was gone. Whatever arrangement the family had maintained, submitting just enough to survive, preserving just enough autonomy to be worth preserving, had ended with Gyun's death. What replaced it was not an updated version of the arrangement, but its abolition. The Castrioti Principality ceased to exist as a political entity. There was nothing left to preserve through accommodation. One source records that Skanderbeg formally petitioned the Sultan to have the family territory restored to him as the surviving heir. The petition was refused. The land stayed Ottoman. The son who had given the empire 20 years of excellent military service was told, in the plainest administrative terms available, that his service had bought him nothing. The lands were gone and would remain gone. The arrangement that had made 20 years of service tolerable had been voided by the empire that had asked for the service. The anger that followed, the chronicles are consistent that he was furious, is the most human moment in the whole narrative before the defection itself. He was not an ideological rebel. He was not only motivated by a theological objection to Ottoman rule, or to the Crusade or any of the large frames of later tradition. He was also a man who had been cheated. The fundamental promise of the Devshirme, that capable service would be rewarded, that loyalty would be met with something worth being loyal for, had been broken. The lands his father had died holding, the lands he had administered as an Ottoman governor, had been handed to someone with no claim and no connection. And the man to whom they should have gone had been told, in effect, that his claim was nothing and his service was forgotten. He had been patient for 20 years. His patience ended when he understood that patience itself had been the trap. And then, in 1443, something happened on a battlefield in Serbia that gave him the window he had been waiting for. Part 3. The Defection. The autumn of 1443 was, by any measure, a dangerous moment for the Ottoman Empire in Europe. A crusading army had assembled. It was the last serious crusading force that medieval Christendom would ever field with genuine intent to use it. The Hungarian regent John Hunyadi was one of the ablest commanders in Europe, the man who had already beaten Ottoman forces at multiple engagements across the previous decade. He had organized a coalition. It included Hungarian and Polish troops under King Władysław III, Serbian contingents under the despot Đurđ Branković, and Wallachian forces from across the Danube. The scale of the force was significant, perhaps 25,000 men at its peak. It was large enough that Murad II took it seriously. He took it seriously enough to lead the Ottoman response personally through the autumn campaign of 1443. That campaign culminated in a series of engagements in Serbia and Bulgaria that went badly for the Ottomans. Skanderbeg was in that campaign. He commanded a contingent of Albanian cavalry, his own men, troops from the region his family had controlled, fighting under Ottoman command in the field. He had fought under these arrangements before. He would not fight under them again. The exact mechanics of the defection are partly obscured by the distance of time and the competing claims of the sources. What the best evidence suggests is this. The Battle of Niš was fought on November 3rd, 1443, and there Hunyadi broke the Ottoman lines and sent Murad's forces into retreat. Somewhere in the chaos and confusion of that withdrawal, Skanderbeg and approximately 300 Albanian cavalrymen slipped away from the Ottoman column. He knew the territory. He had a plan. He was not running blindly into the dark. He found an Ottoman scribe in the confusion of the retreat. He forced the man to write a letter, or dictated one, and had it authenticated at sword's point. The sources vary on the method but agree on the result. The letter purported to come from Sultan Murad II himself. It appointed Skanderbeg as the new governor of Krujë, the fortress city in northern Albania that sat at the geographic and symbolic heart of the Castrioti patrimony. The forgery was competent. It was authenticated with what appeared to be the appropriate seals and formal language. And on November 28th, 1443, Skanderbeg rode into Krujë at the head of his 300 men and presented the letter to the Ottoman garrison commander. The garrison commander believed it. He surrendered the city. Within hours, the Ottoman soldiers in Krujë were given a choice: convert to Christianity and stay, or leave. Most of them left. The few who stayed were baptized. Skanderbeg walked into the cathedral that had been converted to a mosque during the Ottoman occupation. In front of whatever witnesses were present, he renounced Islam and affirmed his Christian faith. The chronicles are specific that he used the language of return. He was going back to the faith in which he had been baptized, not adopting a new one, ad fidem baptismi sui revertens, returning to the faith of his baptism. Whether or not he had secretly maintained that faith through 20 years of Ottoman service, that was the frame he chose for the public act. He raised a red banner with a black double-headed eagle above the walls of Krujë. That flag, the double-headed eagle, the symbol the Castrioti family had used on their seals and documents for generations, is flying today above the Albanian Republic. The flag of modern Albania is that flag. When he raised it in November 1443, he was raising more than a military standard. He was raising a declaration about who was being resurrected. Not the Ottoman officer, but the Albanian lord. The son of Dion Castrioti, back in his father's city, back in his father's faith, with a sword in his hand and an empire coming to take it all back. What he had done was, by Ottoman law, apostasy. Apostasy from Islam was punishable by death. He had deserted a campaign army in the field, which was also punishable by death. He had forged an imperial document, which was punishable by death. He had seized an imperial fortress and killed or expelled the garrison, which was punishable by death. He had, in the space of a single night, committed 4 capital offenses against the most powerful military state in this part of the world. He knew all of this. He had spent 20 years inside the system. He understood exactly what he had done and exactly what it meant. He was not surprised when, within months, Murad II began organizing the response. He spent the winter of 1443 to 1444 moving fast. He swept through the surrounding Albanian territory, taking the fortresses the Ottomans had garrisoned: Petrella, Preza, Guriabadha, Svetigrad, Modric. He gave the defenders the same choice he had given the garrison at Krujë: baptism or departure. He sent messengers to the Albanian lords, the fractious competing noble families that had been maneuvering between Ottoman and Venetian authority for decades. He told them what he had done and what he was proposing to do. The message was not subtle. He had taken Krujë. He was taking the fortresses. He was going to fight. The question was whether they would fight with him or stand aside while the empire came to get him and them. That last element, and them, was the heart of the political argument. The Albanian lords had been managing their relationship with the Ottomans since before Kosovo. They understood that the calculus had changed with Skanderbeg's defection. The empire could not allow the example of a successful Albanian resistance to stand. If Skanderbeg held Krujë and was not crushed, every Albanian lord with territory in the highlands would be watching. Some of them would draw the conclusion that resistance was viable and join him. And the Ottoman project of reducing the Albanian highland interior to orderly provincial administration would be set back by a generation or more. Murad II understood this. The Albanian lords understood this. Skanderbeg's message in the winter of 1443 to 1444 was simple. The Ottoman response, when it came, would not distinguish between Albanian lords who had joined the resistance and Albanian lords who had stayed neutral. The empire, once mobilized, would take them all. The only question was whether they went under fighting or whether they went under as collaborators whose collaboration had ultimately bought them nothing. This was not, strictly speaking, an honest argument. Some Albanian lords did negotiate their positions with the Ottomans and maintain their status for years after Skanderbeg's death. The empire's practice was more complex than the all-or-nothing framing suggested. But it worked as a recruitment argument. In the winter of 1443 to 1444, with an Ottoman army certainly coming in the spring, it was effective enough to get the men Skanderbeg needed into a room together in March. On March 2nd, 1444, in the cathedral of the Venetian coastal city of Lezé, 9 of the leading Albanian noble families assembled. The Ducagini, who held the highlands to the north, the Arianiti, whose patriarch Gergai Arianiti had been fighting the Ottomans since the 1430s, the Muzaka, the Thopia, the Balshich heirs, the others. They elected Skanderbeg Captain General of the League of Albanian Princes. The League of Lezë, as history would call it, was not a kingdom. It was not a unified state. It was a military coalition of independent lords who had agreed for the moment to fight together under a single commander. Its internal politics would never be simple. The Albanian noble families had been feuding with each other as long as they had been feuding with everyone else. Skanderbeg would spend as much energy managing the alliances within the League as he spent fighting the Ottomans outside it. The Venetians were present at the founding and gave their approval. They saw in the League a potential buffer between the Ottoman advance and their own coastal holdings. That approval was conditional and calculated, as Venetian approval of everything always was. But it meant the League had a formal legitimacy in the political context of the period. A Christian coalition, assembled in a Venetian city under Venetian observation with the implicit endorsement of the most important commercial republic in the Adriatic. When the Pope and the King of Naples eventually formalized their own support for Skanderbeg's resistance, the League of Lezë gave them something to formally support. A named body, a designated commander, a political structure they could route money and letters through. This mattered more than it might seem. European powers in the 15th century did not send support to individuals. They sent it to recognize political entities with commanders who had accepted the appropriate hierarchical relationships. Skanderbeg gave them that structure in March 1444, and the structure made his resistance legible to the political vocabulary of the age in a way that a pure warlord rebellion would not have been. It was also real. It was the only organized Christian military force between the Danube and the Adriatic actively fighting the Ottomans in 1444, and it had a commander who knew how to use it. The empire was already moving. Part 4. The Battle of Torvioll. Murad II did not waste time. By early summer of 1444, the Ottoman response was in motion. A force of roughly 25,000 men moved into Albania under the command of Ali Pasha, one of Murad's senior military commanders. Some accounts say more. The numbers in medieval chronicles are always aspirational, but 25,000 is the figure that appears most consistently in the sources. His orders were to retake what the Albanian renegade had seized, and to make an example of him sufficient to discourage any future defections. Ali Pasha had every reason for confidence. He was leading a professional force of Ottoman regulars against an Albanian coalition whose total strength Skanderbeg could not have fielded at more than 15,000, probably fewer. The Ottomans had numerical superiority, better resupply, and the institutional depth of an empire against a loose alliance of hill lords. The conventional military logic of the age was straightforwardly on their side. Skanderbeg did not fight by the conventional military logic of the age. He had spent 20 years studying how the Ottomans thought, how they moved, what their assumptions were, and where their assumptions produced vulnerability. He understood the doctrine, the opening cavalry screen, the progression to heavy infantry, the reliance on numbers to generate the weight that broke opposing formations. He knew it from the inside. And he understood what the doctrine assumed. It assumed an opponent who would form up on flat ground, accept the terms of a conventional engagement, and be ground down by the superior force. He had no intention of being that opponent. The Ottoman army that moved through the passes into the Albanian highland interior in the spring of 1444 was, structurally, a siege and advance force. It was designed to move through enemy territory, reduce fortifications, and establish administrative control. It was excellent at that work. The Janissary infantry were the finest professional foot soldiers in the world during this period, disciplined and trained to a standard that European feudal armies could not match. The Ottoman cavalry, Sipahi and Akinja, were fast and effective on open ground. The army's supply train was the product of a century of military development. So was its logistical organization. So were its institutional procedures, covering everything from fortification engineering to prisoner administration. All of it came from 100 years of campaigns across 3 continents. Ali Pasha was commanding the most capable military machine in the known world. He was also commanding it into the Albanian highlands, where every advantage the Ottoman military possessed was either neutralized or inverted. The narrow passes that gave access to the interior channeled his army into formations it had not been designed to use. The Ottoman cavalry that was devastating on the Thracian plain or the Bulgarian lowlands had nowhere to maneuver in mountain defiles. The numerical advantage that could destroy an opposing army on flat ground produced, in the passes, nothing but a longer column that was harder to supply and easier to ambush. The Janissary infantry had broken formations at Nicopolis and Varna, but they could not be deployed in the disciplined mass formations their doctrine required, when the approach to the enemy position ran through forested gorges with visibility measured in tens of yards. Skanderbeg had picked the plain of Torvioll, near the town of Peshkopi, as his chosen ground. It was not a pass, it was a valley floor, which the sources describe as allowing some conventional deployment. He had assembled his force, 8,000 cavalry, and roughly 7,000 infantry by the sources' reckoning, and positioned them to receive the Ottoman advance. He had a contingent of approximately 2,000 paid permanent troops, professionals of the kind that any serious commander needed for operations that required reliable discipline. These were supplemented by the feudal levies that the Albanian lords had contributed to the League. The battle opened in what appears to have been a conventional fashion. Albanian infantry engaged the Ottoman advance guard on the valley floor, while the Ottoman main body deployed. Then Skanderbeg executed the move he had been trained to understand and had now learned to use against its teachers. He had positioned a substantial cavalry force in concealment in the woods on the Ottoman flanks. The sources suggest 8,000 horse in total, though the distribution was complex. When the Ottoman main body committed to the infantry engagement in the center, when the Ottoman formation was fully extended and focused on the frontal battle, the Albanian cavalry came out of the woods and hit both flanks simultaneously. The Ottoman response to a simultaneous flanking attack requires a particular quality. It requires the ability to reorient formations, to pull troops from the engaged center and redirect them to the threatened flanks, without losing the coherence that makes formed infantry effective. It requires officers who know what to do, and soldiers who trust their officers enough to execute a difficult lateral movement under fire. The best professional armies can manage it. A force caught mid-engagement in an unexpected position often cannot. Ali Pasha's force was professional enough to attempt it. It was not fast enough to succeed. The Albanian cavalry had the momentum, and the Albanian infantry maintained the pressure at the center. The Ottoman formation, caught between the frontal engagement and the flank attacks, broke. When a formation of that size breaks, it does not simply retreat in order, it collapses. Men run back the way they came, others stand and die, and the collective discipline that made the formation a military unit dissolves in the few minutes of contact with cavalry coming from unexpected directions. The Albanian horsemen pursued into the retreating Ottoman force, killing and capturing across the floor of the valley and back into the passes. Ali Pasha himself was among the dead. The figures the chroniclers record, 7,000 to 10,000 Ottoman dead, 500 to 2,000 prisoners may or may not be exact, but they represent a military catastrophe of a scale that would have been headline news in any capital of Europe. The news reached Rome within weeks. Pope Eugenius IV had been attempting to organize a crusading effort, and he understood immediately what had happened. A man in the Albanian highlands had just destroyed a major Ottoman army in pitched battle. He wrote to Skanderbeg directly. He encouraged Hunyadi to organize the expedition that would become the Crusade of Varna. He declared Skanderbeg the champion of Christendom, the first of the formal papal designations that would follow Skanderbeg for the rest of his life. Skanderbeg accepted the designation with what the sources suggest was his characteristic manner, direct, without excessive ceremony, already focused on what came next. He understood that Torvioll was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. Murad II would come himself before long. The question was not whether the next Ottoman force would be larger. It would. The question was whether Skanderbeg could make the same logic work against a force 10 times what Ali Pasha had brought. He spent the months between Torvioll and the next major engagement doing what he always did in the breathing spaces between campaigns, fortifying, rebuilding, training, and managing the internal politics of the League with the same deliberate attention he gave to military preparation. The Albanian lords needed to be held together. This was its own kind of warfare, slower, less dramatic, without the clean resolution of a battlefield, but in some ways it was more demanding, because it never ended. He held it together. For 25 years he held it together. That is itself a kind of military achievement, one the chronicle tradition underweights because it produces no dramatic scenes to record. Part 5. The Art of the Unwinnable War. Torvioll was not the end of anything. It was the announcement of a style. In the weeks after the battle, Skanderbeg pursued what remained of Ali Pasha's force as far as the passes would allow, and then stopped. He did not pursue the Ottomans into territory where his advantages disappeared and their advantages returned. He understood that there was a kind of warfare he could win and a kind he could not. And he understood that the discipline to fight only the first kind was more important than any individual tactical skill. That instinct came from years of watching how the Ottoman military worked, from the inside. He was not going to march on Constantinople. He was not going to reduce Ottoman-held cities in the south with an army of 15,000 men. He was going to make Albania so costly to occupy that the Ottoman calculation would eventually shift from conquest to containment. That was the strategic logic. It was sound. It was also, practically speaking, exhausting in a way the chronicles tend to underweight, because exhaustion does not produce dramatic scenes. The League of Leza that he had assembled in March 1444 was a coalition of lords. They all had their own interests, their own feuds, and their own calculations about how much they were willing to risk for the common defense. Skanderbeg held the title of Captain General and commanded the combined military force, but the text of the League's founding is explicit that he had no authority to interfere in the internal affairs of the member principalities. He was primus inter pares, first among equals. It is a formula that gives the leading figure just enough authority to coordinate and not enough to dictate. He had to lead by persuasion and by results. When he won, the lords reaffirmed their commitment. When he struggled, they recalculated. After Torvioll, Murad II did something that a less proud ruler might have done sooner. He tried to buy what he could not take. He sent envoys to Skanderbeg offering autonomy within the empire. It was essentially the same vassal arrangement that Guillaume Castrioti had maintained, paying tribute and providing military service in exchange for retaining the principality's nominal independence. The offer included an annual stipend of 10,000 crowns. Skanderbeg refused it. According to his biographer, He told the Ottoman envoys that he would refuse even if Murad offered half the empire. The offer itself was the most telling thing about his position. The Sultan was not offering autonomy as a gift. He was offering it because the campaign to end the resistance by force had failed. What he was proposing was the conversion of a military problem into an administrative one, the same arrangement that had failed to hold George Castrioti in Ottoman service was now being proposed as a way to get the Albanian problem under control without another Torvioll. To accept it was to return to the position his father had occupied. Dependent on Ottoman goodwill, the children available to be sent east as hostages the next time the Sultan needed them. He had been that system's product. He was not going to put his own son in that position. Murad came after him again. In 1445, a new Ottoman force moved into Albania, and Skanderbeg met it at the mountain of Mokra. He ambushed the column in the passes and destroyed it with the same combination of terrain exploitation and cavalry timing that had worked at Torvioll. In 1446, another Ottoman campaign penetrated further into the highland interior, burning villages and ravaging crops. It was the scorched earth strategy the Ottomans used when they could not engage the Albanian force on terms they controlled. Skanderbeg let them burn. He could not defend every village. He could not be everywhere at once. The villages would be rebuilt. The Ottoman army burning them was an Ottoman army not concentrating on Krujë. This had a human cost. The cost to the Albanian population of living inside a resistance that the Ottomans answered with systematic destruction. It is something the military chronicle tradition consistently underweights. The Albanian highlands that supported Skanderbeg's campaign were not an abstraction. They were farmers and herders and craftsmen and their families living on land that was repeatedly burned. They were drafted into a fighting force that could not pay them what an imperial treasury could. They sheltered a mobile army in their villages, hid it in their high pastures, fed it from their own stores when the supplies from Naples and Venice ran short. The resistance required their constant contribution, and they gave it, but the cost is one the military historians don't always stop to account for. The year 1447 brought the Albanian-Venetian conflict, and it interrupted the anti-Ottoman campaign at the worst possible time. The dispute over the fortress of Dagenham spiraled into a brief war with the Venetians, and it cost Skanderbeg resources and political energy he could not spare. He managed it, made peace on workable terms, and went back to fighting the Ottomans. That is, in miniature, the story of the entire 25 years, managing the problems that were not the main problem, so that the main problem could be addressed. 1448 brought the loss of Svetegrad, the first significant fortress he had failed to hold. The water was cut off by the Ottoman besiegers, and the garrison was eventually forced to surrender. It was a real loss. Svetegrad controlled the eastern approaches, and its fall complicated every future campaign in that corridor. He rebuilt where he could and accepted what he couldn't change. There was no alternative. In October 1448, at the Second Battle of Kosovo, John Hunyadi's crusading force was destroyed by the Ottomans. It was fought on the same field where the original Kosovo had ended Serbian independence. The defeat ended the era of serious Hungarian offensive capacity against the Ottoman advance in the Balkans. Hunyadi would win again at Belgrade in 1456, but the organized crusading strategy was not going to produce the decisive victory its architects kept hoping for. The Albanian resistance found itself increasingly isolated as the broader coalition failed to materialize. Skanderbeg absorbed this and kept fighting. He had been fighting for 5 years. He had won most of what he had fought and lost some of it. The League was intact. The fortresses he needed were mostly held. The Ottomans had not established permanent positions in the Albanian highland interior. He was 43 years old. He had 20 more years of this in front of him. The mathematics of sustained asymmetric warfare, at a personal level, are not something the chronicle tradition gives adequate attention. Skanderbeg was not directing these campaigns from a protected headquarters. He was in the mountains with his men, sleeping rough, moving constantly, available for personal combat when the situation required it. The sources record him fighting in individual engagements well into his 50s. He was, by any reasonable assessment, in the field continuously for the better part of 25 years. The league he was holding together required his constant presence. This is what the later celebration of Skanderbeg as purely a military genius tends to miss. The military genius was in service of a political problem at least as difficult. The lords who stayed in the league year after year, the Arianiti, the Ducagini, the Thopia, were men who could have made their own arrangements with the Ottomans at any point. They didn't. They stayed because Skanderbeg kept giving them reasons to believe the resistance was viable and that the man leading it was worth following. He gave them those reasons by winning, and by winning again, and making the winning look like the natural consequence of a coherent strategy. What it sometimes actually was, a series of desperate improvisations by an outnumbered force trying to survive. Part 6. The First Siege of Krujë. Murad II came himself in 1450. He had not forgotten Torvioll. He had not forgotten the string of battles in the years following it. There was Mokra in 1445, where Skanderbeg ambushed another Ottoman force moving through the mountain passes and destroyed it in the narrow ground. There was Outnumbered in 1446. There was the ongoing attrition that had cost the empire several armies and several commanders in the Albanian highlands, with no corresponding gain. The Sultan was 46 years old. He had spent his reign in constant warfare and had generally won. He had placed his armies from the Danube to the Aegean, and he had watched them stop cold in Albania. He organized the largest single Ottoman military force committed to the Albanian theater in the entire 25 years of the conflict, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 men by the estimates that appear in the sources, and he led it personally into the mountains. The tactical situation Skanderbeg faced in the summer of 1450 was the clearest possible expression of everything that defined his style of warfare. He did not have 60,000 men. He did not have 30,000 men. He had perhaps 15,000 at the absolute peak of what the Albanian principalities could mobilize, and a portion of that force was committed to garrison duty in the fortresses the Ottomans had not yet reached. Against 100,000, the mathematics of a conventional defense were simple and terminal. He made the mathematics irrelevant. Krujë itself held a garrison of roughly 1,500 men under a commander named Vrana Conti. He was a trusted officer who understood exactly what the siege would require of him and his men. The fortress sat on a limestone spur above the valley, its walls incorporating the natural rock face on the steep sides. It was approachable from the south and east, but steep everywhere else. The kind of position that can be held by a small force against a large one, if the garrison has food, water, ammunition, and the will to use them. Vrana Conti had all four. The Ottomans surrounded the city in the spring and began siege operations. Skanderbeg did not sit inside the walls with the garrison. He took his mobile force into the surrounding mountains and became a permanent threat to Ottoman supply lines, communications and rear. He had scouts in every pass. He knew when and where the Ottoman convoys moved. He struck at them constantly, not in set-piece engagements where the Ottoman numbers would tell, but in the raids and ambushes at which the Albanian cavalry excelled, burning supply wagons, killing foraging parties, appearing and disappearing before the Ottoman response could organize. Every week of the siege that passed cost the Ottoman army men and supplies it could not easily replace, in mountainous terrain a long way from its logistics base. Every week the garrison held the walls cost Murad II something he could not purchase back: time. The psychological dimension of what Skanderbeg was doing in those mountains should not be underestimated. He was not simply running a guerrilla campaign to bleed the Ottoman army. He was making a statement, repeated every week across 5 months. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire could bring his entire field army to a limestone fortress in the Albanian highlands and be unable to take it. Every dispatch that left the siege lines and went back to Adrianople was a dispatch announcing failure. Every day the walls stood was a day the whole watching Christian world understood that something was possible they had been told for decades was impossible. You could resist. You could hold. You could bleed the empire dry one foraging party at a time and stand in the mountains watching it not win. The garrison repelled 3 major assaults on the walls. The chronicles describe fighting at the gates, Ottoman infantry climbing ladders to the parapet, the defenders throwing them back, 1,500 men against 100,000. The dead on the Ottoman side accumulated in the approaches. The approaches became difficult to use, and the sight of them became its own kind of argument against the next assault. The Venetians had been selling food to the Ottoman camp, a piece of commercial cynicism that Skanderbeg noted and did not forget. They eventually stopped, when Skanderbeg's pressure on their supply lines made the alternative too costly. In October 1450, Murad II lifted the siege. His army was depleted. Winter was coming down from the mountains, 20,000 of his soldiers were dead, and the walls were still standing. He broke camp and marched his remaining force back to Adrianople. Skanderbeg came down from the mountains and walked into Krujë. The chronicles record that the city erupted. Bonfires, songs. People who had spent 5 months under siege, watching the dead pile up in the approaches and the smoke of burning supply trains in the distance, came out to meet the man who had made it possible. He received messengers from Pope Nicholas V, from Alfonso of Aragon and Naples, from Hunyadi in Hungary. The Pope called him the most redoubtable athlete and fearless warrior of the true faith. Alfonso sent wheat and barley and craftsmen to rebuild what the siege had damaged. Praise arrived from Burgundy, from Venice, from every Catholic court in Europe that understood what had just happened. 3 months later, on February 3rd, 1451, Murad II died in Adrianople. He had spent the last major campaign of his life against a mountain fortress in Albania, and had not been able to take it. The man he had tried to break and failed to break was still there, in the city above the valley, with the double-headed eagle flying above the walls. Part 7. The Genius of Albulena. Murad was in the ground. His son Mehmed II took the throne at 19, and he had other priorities, primarily Constantinople, which fell in May 1453. For a few years after the Great Siege, the Albanian theatre enjoyed a relative pause. Skanderbeg used the pause. He knew it was temporary. He rebuilt what the 1450 campaign had damaged, reorganized the League, and negotiated a formal alliance with Alfonso of Naples. The Treaty of Gaeta, signed in March 1451, recognized him nominally as Alfonso's vassal in exchange for Neapolitan protection and supply. The arrangement was diplomatically necessary and practically limited, but it meant that ships from Naples could legally operate in his support, and that the papacy, always friendly to Alfonso, was more formally in the same coalition. The next years brought campaigns without a single decisive battle, the grinding middle period of a long war where success is measured in what did not happen rather than in clean victories. Ottoman forces probed the Albanian passes regularly. Skanderbeg moved to meet them. The mountain passes changed hands, or didn't. The Albanian cavalry rode out and came back. The League held. Then, in 1455, he made his one serious misjudgment of the whole resistance. The city of Berat in southern Albania was a significant Ottoman-held position that Skanderbeg had long recognized as strategically important. In July 1455, with Mehmed occupied in Serbia, he committed 12,000 Albanians and 2,000 Neapolitan soldiers with siege artillery to taking it. The city offered to surrender within 11 days if no relief came. Relief came. Isabeг Evrinoz, an experienced Ottoman commander, arrived before the 11 days were up and caught Skanderbeg with his force divided. Part of the army was committed to the siege lines, part was in the field, and neither part was in the right position when the Ottoman relief column appeared. Skanderbeg was away from the battlefield on diplomatic business when the worst of it happened. His brother-in-law Teodor Muzaka was killed in the fighting. The Albanian army broke and retreated with significant losses. Berat stayed Ottoman. The aftermath of Berat was more dangerous than the battle itself. Military failure has a specific effect on coalition politics. It gives the doubters a reason to act. Within months, 2 of Skanderbeg's most trusted Albanian officers had defected to the Ottomans. There was Moisi Arianit Golemi, who had served with him since the early campaigns, and later there was Hamza Castrooti, Skanderbeg's own nephew. Both men accepted Ottoman appointments and military commands. Golemi returned to Albanian soil with an Ottoman force in 1456, fighting against the league he had helped build. Skanderbeg met him at Oranik and defeated him, and then he accepted Golemi back into the Albanian side when the defeated commander asked to rejoin, a gesture that said something about the kind of political intelligence required to hold the league together. You cannot build a coalition in difficult circumstances by making permanent enemies of every man who calculates wrong once. Hamza was a different case. The nephew who had been raised under Skanderbeg's protection defected to the Ottomans and accepted joint command of the next major invasion force alongside Isabeг. He knew Skanderbeg's tactics. He had fought under him. He understood how the Albanian cavalry operated, where the feigned retreats led, what the mountain positions were designed to accomplish. This was the most specific kind of threat the League had ever faced. Not simply an Ottoman army coming through the passes, but an Ottoman army guided by a man who had watched the whole thing from the inside. Skanderbeg's response to that threat was the thing the historians who study him most carefully tend to regard as his military masterpiece. The Ottoman invasion force moved into Albania in late May 1457, advancing through the Mat River Valley toward the Albanian heartland. Skanderbeg made contact with the vanguard, probed it, and then, as Hamza and Isabeг watched, their familiarity with his methods now supposed to be an advantage, he appeared to retreat. It was not a controlled tactical retreat of the kind he had executed dozens of times, placing his force in a position to counterattack. It was a genuine retreat, or what looked like one. His army dissolved into the mountains in multiple fragments, moving in different directions, leaving no coherent force for the Ottoman advance to engage. The Venetian captain of Durrës sent a dispatch to the Doge in late July 1457. It reported that Skanderbeg had taken to the mountains to save his head, and that everyone had abandoned him. Ottoman commanders surveying the Mat Valley found no Albanian force. They moved through it. They pillaged and burned without opposition. They proceeded through the region with the confidence of men who had already won. They were not wrong about the facts. Skanderbeg's force had genuinely dispersed into the mountains. What they were wrong about was what dispersal meant. It was not defeat. It was the setup for Albulena. He had split his force into several independent detachments and ordered them to remain hidden in the highlands. Unseen, inactive, making no contact with Ottoman scouts, leaving nothing to track. They sheltered in the mountain villages, fed and concealed by the local population. The Ottoman army, operating without opposition through the valley below, gradually relaxed. The reports going back to the Sultan said the Albanian leader was broken and fleeing. The army in the valley began to behave the way armies behave when they believe the war is effectively over, establishing a fortified camp, sending out foraging parties, settling into the routine of occupation rather than the heightened alertness of a contested campaign. They stayed in that posture through the summer, through July, through August, into September. Hamza Castrioti and Isa Beg knew Skanderbeg's tactics. What they did not know was what Skanderbeg looked like when he was doing something he had never done before. On September 2nd, 1457, Skanderbeg gave the signal. The location is one the sources call Albulena, or Ujabada, white water, the Albanian name for the river there, somewhere in the province of Kurban in north-central Albania. The dispersed Albanian detachments converged simultaneously, from the hidden positions in the surrounding highlands, from multiple directions at once. The Albanian cavalry and infantry poured down onto the Ottoman camp. Not a skirmish, not a raid, a coordinated assault from positions the Ottoman force had no idea were occupied, against an army that had spent months believing it had already won. The Ottoman camp broke. The chronicles, with their characteristic numerical aspirations, report up to 30,000 Ottoman troops killed or captured. Even discounted substantially, that represents a catastrophic defeat. Hamza Castrioti was captured and sent as a prisoner to Naples. Isa Beg escaped with what remained of the force. The valley that the Ottomans had moved through unopposed all summer was theirs no longer. It had turned in the space of a single afternoon in early September. What Skanderbeg had done at Albulena was so far outside the tactical assumptions of the age that the Venetian diplomats who had been reporting his defeat had to reverse themselves within weeks. He had let the enemy believe he was finished for 3 months. He had kept 15,000 Albanian fighters hidden in mountain villages for the entire summer, without a single significant contact that would have alerted the Ottoman camp. And he had done it in a coalition army of lords who were not always noted for their discipline. He had waited longer than any of his opponents thought was possible to wait. And then he had been everywhere at once. Albulena is the battle the Albanian historians identify as his greatest. The military historians who have studied the period tend to agree. It is the battle that shows most clearly what kind of mind was directing the Albanian resistance. Not the courage, which was never in question, but the patience. It showed the ability to sustain a strategy across months of apparent inaction, while the pressure to act built from every direction, the willingness to accept looking defeated in the short term in order to be actually victorious when it mattered. He was 52 years old in September 1457. He had been fighting for 14 years. He had, at Albulena, just won his most complete victory. Part 8. Mehmed the Conqueror and the Fall of the World. The man who succeeded Murad II was 19 years old, and the first thing he did that mattered was take Constantinople. Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror as history knows him, moved on Constantinople in the spring of 1453, 2 years after his father's death. The city had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. It was the last living remnant of Rome in the East, the place the Orthodox world called the New Rome, the ultimate prize that every Ottoman Sultan since Murad I had understood. Its walls were the engineering marvel of the medieval world, the Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century and never successfully breached by a conventional attack in 1,000 years. 20 kilometers of stone and brick that had held against Avars, Bulgars, Arabs, Crusaders, and earlier Ottomans. Mehmed brought cannon. He brought a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor. The empire told him it could not afford him, and the Ottomans then contracted him at 4 times the price. The cannon Orban built for Mehmed could fire a stone ball weighing 600 pounds. The Theodosian walls were not designed for that. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died fighting in the walls. The Ottoman flag went up over Hagia Sophia. The bells of the Western Church rang in mourning from London to Lisbon. The crusade that had always been coming and never quite arrived had arrived too late, and the city it was supposed to protect was gone. To understand what Constantinople's fall meant, you have to understand what the city had represented for 700 years of European consciousness. It was not just a political capital. It was the proof that Rome had not entirely died. It was the proof that the Christian civilization which had grown out of the Roman world still had a living institutional center, that the Bishop of Rome and the Emperor of Constantinople between them represented something continuous and real. When Mehmed's flag went up above Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom became a mosque. They did not simply capture a city, they extinguished a world. The scholars who had been copying classical manuscripts in Constantinople for generations packed what they could and scattered toward Italy, carrying Greek texts that had not been read in the West for centuries. The humanists of Florence and Venice who received them understood immediately what they were holding. The fall of Constantinople was, among other things, the thing that accelerated the recovery of classical Greek learning in the West. That is one of the stranger consequences of catastrophe. The empire's ending scattered the seeds of something that would become the High Renaissance. Skanderbeg was fighting his way through the middle years of the Albanian resistance when the news came in. He had already won Torvioll, already held the first challenges, already built the reputation that made him the only Christian commander in the world who was consistently beating Ottoman armies in the field. Constantinople's fall did not change the military situation in northern Albania directly, but it changed the context in which every political argument he made to European courts was received. He had been arguing for years that the Ottomans, left unchecked, would not stop in the Balkans. The advance would continue into Italy, into Hungary, into the heart of Catholic Europe. Constantinople made that argument impossible to dismiss. Mehmed II, who had conquered the city at 19, made no secret of his ambitions. He wanted Rome. He said so. He intended to be, in his own account of himself, the new Caesar ruling from the city of Caesar. The fall of Constantinople sent a ripple through every political calculation in Europe, and Skanderbeg felt it as clearly as anyone. He had spent the previous decade building his alliance structure carefully. The papacy, Naples, Venice, Hungary, and managing the permanent tension between the powers that nominally supported him. Venice was the most complicated. The Venetians held the Albanian coastal cities and had commercial agreements with the Ottomans that they valued more than they valued Skanderbeg's rebellion. They had sold food to Murad II's army during the siege of Krujë. They had blockaded Albanian ports when Skanderbeg's activities threatened their trading relationships. They were, in the cold calculus of the Adriatic Republic, always and only interested in what benefited Venice. And yet, after Constantinople fell, the commercial logic shifted slightly. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant threat that might be managed through accommodation. It was the power that now controlled the entrance to the Black Sea, the trade routes to the east, and the city Venice had held privileged access to for a century. The fall of Constantinople did not make Venice Skanderbeg's friend, but it made the arithmetic of opposing the Ottomans slightly less disadvantageous than it had been. Skanderbeg played that arithmetic with the skill of a man who had been navigating the politics of competing powers since before he came back to Albania. He understood that the Venetians, the Neapolitans, and the papacy all wanted different things from him. He needed all of them to varying degrees, and keeping them engaged without becoming wholly dependent on any one of them required a constant attention to the particular interests of each. He was, for a military commander, a remarkably effective diplomat, partly because he had spent 20 years in the Ottoman court learning how power actually worked, partly because his military record gave him something real to offer to anyone worried about the Ottoman advance, and partly because he had the personal quality of making men believe he was in control of a situation that was, by any objective measure, extremely uncertain. The years between the first siege of Krujë in 1450 and Mehmed's major Albanian campaign in 1466 were not quiet. They were a continuous oscillation between campaign and diplomacy, between fighting and negotiating, between the demands of the League's internal politics and the demands of the war that never fully stopped. Skanderbeg fought at Berat in 1455, a siege he could not reduce and eventually withdrew from. It was one of the rare unsuccessful campaigns of his record. He fought at Oranek in 1456, a victory. He fought through the late 1450s in a series of engagements that kept the Ottomans from consolidating in northern Albania, while Mehmed was occupied with campaigns in Hungary and Serbia and the wider project of digesting the empire he had inherited and expanded. In 1460 to 1461 he sailed to Italy and fought for Ferdinand of Naples against the Angevine pretender to the Neapolitan throne. It was a reminder that his military services were available to the League of Christian powers he was trying to maintain, and that his reputation in Italy was established enough that Ferdinand paid for the help. He returned to Albania and resumed the war. In 1463, Pope Pius II designated him commander-in-chief of a planned crusade, the grandest European anti-Ottoman project since Varna in 1444. The crusade was real, ships assembled, armies organized, the full weight of papal diplomacy thrown behind it. Pius II himself, old and ill, went personally to Ancona to lead the expedition. He died there on August 14th, 1464, before the crusade could sail. The army dispersed. The great European counterattack that would never quite happen had not quite happened again. Skanderbeg absorbed this with the practicality of a man who had long ago stopped expecting Europe to save Albania. The popes wrote letters, the kings sent promises, the Venetians calculated their interests. None of it changed the fundamental reality. The Albanian highlands were defended by the men of the Albanian highlands, and the man who led them was the reason they were still defending anything at all. Part 9. Mehmed Comes. Mehmed II had the patience of an empire. He had watched Skanderbeg for years from Constantinople, receiving the reports of failed campaigns and dead commanders and armies that went into the Albanian mountains and came back reduced. He had other things to do. The conquest of Constantinople had opened an entire menu of expansion. Serbia was subdued in 1459. Bosnia was conquered in 1463. The Venetian positions in the Aegean under sustained pressure. Trebizond on the Black Sea fell in 1461. The empire he was building was the largest the region had seen since Rome. Mehmed administered it with a personal intelligence and energy that contemporary observers, even hostile ones, acknowledged with something close to awe. He read Greek philosophical texts and corresponded with Italian humanists. He had his portrait painted by Gentile Bellini. He was, by the measures of his own age, a man of genuine cultivation. He was also methodical. The Albanian problem had been persistent and annoying for a decade and a half. But Skanderbeg was not, in the immediate term, an existential threat to the empire the way a consolidating Hungary or a revitalized Venetian naval presence might be. He dealt with the larger threats first. He returned to the Albanian question when his position was consolidated enough to bring the full weight of his resources to bear. By 1466, that moment had arrived. He came in person, as his father had come in 1450, and he brought a force whose scale the sources report variously but consistently in terms of overwhelming Ottoman superiority. He also came with an idea his father had not had. If he could not take Krujë by direct assault, he would build a fortress of his own nearby, a permanent Ottoman military base in the Albanian highland interior that would change the strategic geometry of the resistance entirely. He chose a site in a valley to the south of Krujë, and he built Elbasan. The name means subdued country in Turkish. The fortress went up with Ottoman efficiency. Mehmed's army was the finest engineering force in the world during this period, and when it was complete, it represented a qualitative change in the strategic situation. The Ottomans now had a permanent fortified base inside Albania, not on the periphery but in the interior. From there they could sustain sieges and project force in ways they had not been able to manage from Adrianople or Skopje. He besieged Krujë again. The commander of the garrison in 1466 was Tanush Thopia, a loyal Albanian noble. The situation was structurally similar to 1450, Skanderbeg in the mountains with his mobile force, hitting supply lines and flanks while the garrison held the walls. The difference was Skanderbeg himself. He was 61 years old, and 20 years of mountain warfare had done to his body what mountain warfare does. The strategic context had also shifted in ways that made the 1466 siege harder to manage than the one Murad had fought 16 years earlier. Venice was now formally at war with the Ottomans. The First Ottoman-Venetian War had begun in 1463, and the Venetians were, for the first time in Skanderbeg's long experience of them, genuinely his allies rather than his commercial competitors. This changed the supply situation, the sea lanes, the ability to receive provisions and reinforcements from the Adriatic. It also changed the diplomatic weight he carried in European courts. He was now part of a formal military coalition rather than a lone defender, and that coalition had something like a shared military strategy, however imperfectly executed. The Ottoman siege camp settled in around Krujë in the summer of 1466. Skanderbeg went into the mountains with whatever mobile force he could assemble. It was smaller than what he had operated with in 1450, because 15 years of continuous warfare had taken a toll on the Albanian population's ability to field men. He began the same operations that had broken his father's siege: the mountain raids on supply lines, the interception of foraging parties, the constant pressure on the Ottoman rear that prevented the besieging force from fully concentrating on the walls. The Ottomans had learned from 1450 in one respect. They had built Elbasan, which gave them a logistics base more secure than the long supply lines from Adrianople had been. But the mountains had not changed, and the Albanian cavalry that knew the mountains had not been destroyed. The raids continued, the siege lines were harassed, the garrison held. One of Mehmed's key commanders in the Albanian campaign of 1466 to 1467 was a man named Balaban Pasha. He was an Albanian by origin, like Stanisha Kastrioti, a product of the Devshirme who had risen to high command in Ottoman service. He was, in other words, the full realization of what George Kastrioti was supposed to have become. The Albanian boy processed through the Ottoman system into an Ottoman general, loyal to the Sultan, effective in the field, fighting against the people he had come from. He was killed in the fighting during the siege campaign. The sources give no details on how it happened. He died in the Albanian highlands trying to subdue the resistance that his own counterpart had built. In 1467, Mehmed lifted the second siege and withdrew. It was the second time a Sultan of the Ottoman Empire had brought his full strength to bear on the fortress in the Albanian highlands and been turned away. The walls were still standing. The flag was still flying. The man in the mountains was still there. He would not be there much longer, but the fortress would stand for another decade after he was gone, and the resistance would continue for 11 years after his death. And the story the Albanians would tell each other for the next 4 centuries while the empire ruled them was the story of what the man in those mountains had held, and how long he had held it. Part 10. The soldier signs his letters. We have a habit in the modern world of imagining Christian virtue as a gentle thing, patient, quiet, turned toward forgiveness and away from the sword. That is not the Christianity that produced Skanderbeg, and it is not the Christianity he practiced. He was a warrior in the tradition of the Christian warrior. It is a tradition that runs from David through Constantine, through every man who ever stood on a wall between the faith and the army that wanted to erase it. The men in that tradition were not mild. David killed his tens of thousands. Constantine crucified his enemies and burned his rivals and built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the proceeds. The faith was not spread across the Balkans and into the highland valleys of Albania by men who turned the other cheek when an Ottoman army came through the pass. It was carried by men who fought for it, and when they won, they expected the territory to reflect what they had died for. Skanderbeg was that kind of Christian. He was devout in the specific way that the 15th century understood devotion, not as a private spiritual condition, but as a public obligation with a sword attached to it. When he rode into the Albanian fortresses in November 1443 and gave the Ottoman garrisons the choice between baptism and departure, he was not being cruel, he was being precise. A garrison that converted and stayed was a garrison that could be trusted. A garrison that left was no longer his problem. The men who refused both, who stayed unconverted in the fortresses of a Christian resistance, were a security problem that the security standards of the age had a standard answer for. He applied it. That is what commanders in that era did, on both sides in every theater of this war. The difference between Skanderbeg and the Ottomans was not the willingness to use force. It was what they were each using force in service of. The chronicles record that he impaled captured Ottoman officials who refused baptism. His former masters had made that method famous. He used it. There was another man using it at a greater scale in resistance to the Ottomans and in the protection of Christendom. Vlad III of Wallachia, the Impaler. But that's in another video on this channel. This is not a comfortable fact, and the hagiographic tradition tends to either omit it or bury it in the passive voice. But it should be understood for what it was. It was the application of the military and judicial norms of a specific century by a man fighting for a specific cause. We do not judge a physician of the same era for bloodletting. We should be equally careful about judging a warrior of that era for fighting the way warriors of that era fought. What distinguished Skanderbeg was not the softening of those norms, it was the discipline and the purpose behind them. He was not brutal for the pleasure of it. His violence was directional, pointed at the military and administrative apparatus of the occupation, in service of a resistance that had no other tools. The man who ate with his soldiers and slept rough and fought in the front line was not a sadist. He was a commander who understood that the war he was fighting required a certain kind of man, and he had to be that kind of man completely. His chronicler Frengu, who watched him for years, records him as a man of consistent personal piety, attending mass, observing fasts, signing his correspondence in the full formula of a man who understood his service in religious terms. The letters are consistent across 25 years, across correspondence with popes who needed him, Venetians who didn't care, and Albanian lords who were not notably moved by Latin religious formulae. Miles Jesu Christi, soldier of Jesus Christ, he meant it. There is a letter he wrote to Pope Pius II in 1463 that captures this quality with a precision the hagiographers could not have invented, because it is too plain for hagiography. He wrote that he had been taken from his faith by force as a young man, and that he had returned to it freely, and that he would spend whatever remained of his life in the service of that return. Not by persuasion, but by force. He was not a man who had been argued into Christianity, or born into it so softly that it never took. He was a man who had had it taken from him, and had come back for it at considerable personal cost, with full understanding of what the return required. That is not the faith of a man who does not mean it. The inscription on his helmet, preserved in Vienna, reads in Latin, Jesus Nazarene, blesses thee, Prince of Amathia, King of Albania, Terror of the Ottomans, King of Epirus. Terror of the Ottomans. The inscription is not modest about what he was. It is also specific about in whose name he was doing it. The two halves belong together. You cannot separate the blessing from the terror. They describe the same man. The faith authorized the violence, and the violence served the faith. The man who carried that helmet into the mountains of northern Albania understood both halves without apparent difficulty. He sustained the resistance through periods when every rational calculation said the resistance was over. After Berat in 1455, Albanian lords defected. European support was insufficient. The Ottoman army of 1457 was guided by men who knew his tactics from the inside. The Venetians had offered bounties for his assassination, 100 golden ducats annually, the kind of institutional endorsement of murder that only a republic of accountants could formalize. He was 61 years old when Mehmed came with his siege army in 1466. He was managing the illness that would eventually kill him, still in the mountains, still fighting. He never asked Europe to do what Europe would not do. He took the letters and the formal designations and the occasional ships full of grain, and he went back into the mountains and fought the war with what was actually available. He never surrendered. When Murad had offered him restored lands and Ottoman gold after the first siege failed, Skanderbeg told the envoys he would refuse even if offered half the empire. The empire could not take Krujë by force, so it was trying to buy what it could not conquer. He knew what the offer meant. He declined then, and declined every version of it afterward, because he had already decided in a cathedral in November 1443 that he was done being converted, in any sense of the word. The mental resolution that defined him was not bravado. He had spent 20 years inside the empire. He knew exactly what it was capable of. The decision to keep going year after year was made by a man who understood the full cost of the alternative. He chose the harder path because the harder path was the one his code required. He signed his letters Miles Jesu Christi, soldier of Jesus Christ. Not a king, not a warlord, a soldier with a commander carrying out an assignment. Such men are not gentle. They were never meant to be. Part 11. The Last Winter. He died on January 17th, 1468, in Lecce, the same coastal city where the League of Albanian Princes had been formed 24 years earlier in the cathedral. The death was not on a battlefield. It was in a bed, in a city, attended by whatever court and family he had. He was a year or two short of 63. He had been ill for weeks. The chronicles say he summoned the Albanian nobles to him in his final days to discuss the strategy for continuing the resistance after his death. If true, it is the gesture of a man who understood what his death would mean and was trying to manage the problem before it occurred. There was no managing it. He was the League. He was not the only man in it, and not the only capable man, but he was the thing that held it together. The particular combination of military ability, personal authority, and the credibility that came from 25 years of never having lost. No one could replace that. The Albanian nobles had followed him because following him had been, more often than not, the path to survival. They would not follow each other in the same way. The coalition that had functioned because of one man's leadership would not survive the removal of that man. Everyone who attended the meetings in Lecce in January 1468 knew it. He had a wife, Andronica Erianiti, Donica Castrioti, as she is known in the Albanian tradition. He had married her in 1451. She was the daughter of Jurga Erianiti, one of the founding lords of the League of Lecce. The marriage was political in the way that all marriages between noble families in the 15th century were political. But the sources suggest it was also something else. She was there through the campaign years, managing the affairs of Krujë and the Principality, while he was in the mountains. In the context of the Albanian resistance, that was a genuine administrative and political function, not merely a domestic arrangement. She outlived him by 38 years, dying in 1506 in Valencia at the court of the Aragonese. She took their son Gian Castrioti II with her to Naples after Krujë fell. The Castrioti family continued in Italy, the Castriota-Skanderbeg line, for generations. The name and the double-headed eagle seal followed them into the Italian nobility. The son he left was 8 years old when he died. He would not grow up to be his father. No one would. The 8-year-old boy in Lezza in January 1468 would carry the name and the lineage and would eventually lead a resistance of his own. But the thing that had made the resistance work for 25 years was not transmissible through blood. That thing was a specific combination. The inside knowledge of the Ottoman military, the tactical intelligence that had been operating at full capacity since Enderun, the personal authority that came from never having lost. It was the product of a specific life, a specific formation, a specific 20-year education in the best military machine in the world, followed by a 25-year application of everything that education had taught against the teachers themselves. There was one more thing he did in those final weeks in Lezza, as the malaria worked through him and the winter settled over the coast. He called the Albanian lords to him and discussed strategy for the continuation of the resistance after his death. He was 62 years old and dying, and he was running a war council. This is the last thing the sources record him doing before he died, and it is entirely consistent with everything before it. The man whose whole life had been about the fight was still organizing the fight, in the days when organizing his own affairs would have been the conventional priority. He died on January 17th, 1468. He was buried in the Church of St. Nicholas in Lezza. Krujë fell in 1478, 10 years after his death. Without the mobile force in the mountains, without the commander who knew how to use the terrain against the Ottoman numbers, the garrison could not hold indefinitely against a full siege by Mehmed's rebuilt army. The city that had twice broken Ottoman sieges fell to a third one, and Albania passed into Ottoman hands for the next 4 centuries. What had 25 years bought then? More than it might seem. Part 12. What he held and what it meant. The question that a life like Skanderbeg's eventually forces is the question of consequence. He held the Ottomans out of Albania for 25 years. Albania fell anyway. He died in a bed, not on his walls. The empire he fought went on to conquer most of southern Europe within a generation of his death, reaching the gates of Vienna in 1529. Did it matter? It mattered in ways that have to be understood across the whole context of what the 1440s and 1450s and 1460s were in European history. When Skanderbeg returned to Krujë in November 1443, the Ottoman advance into Central Europe was not yet complete. The fall of Constantinople was a decade away. The consolidation of Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia, the great Ottoman project of reducing the Balkans to provincial status, was still in progress. The last serious crusading force that would ever be fielded was in the field and being fought to a standstill. The window in which it was possible to imagine a Christian military response to the Ottoman advance was still, just barely, open. Skanderbeg did not close it, but he kept it from closing faster. Every season the Ottomans committed to the Albanian theatre was a season they did not commit elsewhere. Every army that bled against the limestone walls of Krujë or was cut to pieces in the mountain passes of northern Albania was an army that did not press north against Hungary, did not press west against Venice, did not accelerate the Ottoman consolidation in the Balkans that was already underway. The strategic value of what Skanderbeg was doing was not primarily the preservation of Albanian independence. That was the local consequence. The broader consequence was the constant demand he placed on Ottoman attention and resources. It was the 25-year argument he made with his sword and his mountains that European territory could be made too costly to hold cheaply. The numbers give you the scale of what he was draining. The first siege of Krujë in 1450 cost the Ottomans approximately 20,000 dead, men who died in the approaches, or in the assaults, or from disease in the siege camp across 5 months, against a garrison of 1,500. The Battle of Torvioll cost 7,000 to 10,000 Ottoman soldiers. Albulena cost up to 30,000 killed or captured. Then there were the engagements at Mokra, Ottone, Oranik, and the dozens of raids and ambushes and mountain skirmishes across 25 years. The cumulative Ottoman dead in the Albanian theatre runs into the hundreds of thousands. Against a force that never exceeded 15,000, against a resistance that received, across its entire duration, enough European support to keep it alive but never enough to change its fundamental strategic position. The math of what Skanderbeg extracted from the Ottoman military machine should be understood in context. The Ottoman armies of the mid-15th century were not inexhaustible. They required training, equipment, supply, and the specific institutional knowledge that experienced commanders carried and that died with them when they were killed. When Ali Pasha died at Torvioll, when Balaban Pasha died in the mountains above Krujë, when the Ottoman commanders who fell at Albulena and in 100 smaller engagements were put in the ground, they took with them accumulated military experience that could not simply be replaced from the administrative pool. The empire was large enough to absorb the losses, but it was not so large that the losses were irrelevant. Every Albanian campaign that failed was a campaign that depleted resources the Ottomans would have preferred to deploy elsewhere. And here is the thing that the historians of military strategy tend to emphasize, which the religious narrative sometimes obscures. Florence was 50 years into its renaissance by the time Skanderbeg came back to Krujë. Venice was at the height of its influence. The humanist scholarship that had been slowly accumulating since Petrarch was beginning to produce what it would produce, the painting, the architecture, the philosophy, the recovery of classical learning that would remake the European mind. None of that required Skanderbeg directly, but all of it required time and the security that comes from not being immediately under Ottoman siege. The Ottoman advance did not stop at the Albanian mountains, but the Albanian mountains slowed it, forced it to commit resources and time to a theater that refused to yield in ways that are difficult to quantify precisely and impossible to ignore entirely. He bought time. That is the honest description of what he did. He bought time for a civilization that did not fully appreciate the purchase, and paid the purchaser in letters and promises and occasional ships full of grain. The popes called him the champion of Christendom, and sent him formal designations and almost never sent him enough money. The Venetians used him, managed him, obstructed him, offered bounties on his life, and eventually allied with him when it became undeniable that his mountains were the only reliable shield on their eastern flank. The European powers who could have organized the crusade that might have changed the outcome, organized it repeatedly, never quite launched it, watched Constantinople fall and Albania fall, and went back to their own wars. He had known, probably from early on, that Europe would not save him. The crusade would always be coming and never quite arrive. The alliance with Naples would produce promises and sometimes men, and never enough of either. He fought anyway. He fought with the specificity and the commitment of a man who had decided that the outcome of the world was not his department, but the fighting was. The cultural legacy is harder to quantify than the strategic one, but no less real. The Albanians who lived through the 25 years of resistance did not experience it as a distant political event. They experienced it as their lives, the harvest that was burned before the Ottoman advance, the sons who went into the mountains with Skanderbeg and came back or did not come back, the prayers in the cathedral at Krujë while the Ottoman siege camp sat below the walls. The thing that Skanderbeg was building in those years was not only a military coalition, It was a story, a specific and documented story about what the Albanian people had been and could be, about the fact that resistance was possible and had been sustained by actual human beings in actual Albanian places. That story survived the fall of Krujë. It survived 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. It surfaced in the 19th century Albanian national awakening with exactly the form and the symbolism that Skanderbeg had given it, and the flag he had raised in 1443 was the flag that flew over the Declaration of Independence in 1912. He signed his letters Miles Jesu Christi, Soldier of Jesus Christ. That is not a complicated title. It does not promise outcomes. It does not claim that God will guarantee the victory or preserve the city or prevent the fall. It is the title of a man who has understood his assignment and is carrying it out regardless of the result. The soldier fights the battle. What God does with the battle is God's business. Part 13. The Bones in the Mountains. There is a final thing to understand about Skanderbeg, and it requires looking at what happened after him, not just immediately after, but across the centuries that followed. When Mehmed II heard that Skanderbeg had died in January 1468, his reported response was specific. The sources record him saying something to the effect that Asia and Europe could breathe again. The precise words vary by chronicler, but the sentiment is consistent. A man had died who had been a genuine problem. His death was a relief to an empire that had spent 25 years and enormous resources trying to remove him by force, and had not been able to do it. Within months, the Ottoman army moved on Albania with the full force of the empire's attention no longer divided by the mobile threat in the mountains. The league without Skanderbeg was not the league with him. Leka Dukagini took command of the resistance after Skanderbeg's death. He had been one of the most capable Albanian lords, a real military figure, not a mediocrity thrust into an impossible position. But the Albanian lords who had followed Skanderbeg did not transfer that trust automatically to his successor. They had believed in his military judgment, they had watched him do the impossible repeatedly, and had come to regard the impossible as the normal operating condition of service under him. The coalition that had held together for 25 years began to fracture along the seams that his authority had been holding together. Krujë held. Not for 10 years exactly. That figure is an approximation that rounds the process. The city fell in 1478 after a siege that the garrison fought with the same determination that every Albanian garrison had shown through the whole resistance. The Ottomans, when they finally took it, massacred the civilian population and sold the survivors into slavery. They had been trying to take that city for 25 years, and they were not inclined toward generosity when they finally managed it. When the Ottomans found Skanderbeg's grave in Leza, they opened it. What happened next is the most telling single detail in the entire story. The Ottoman soldiers took fragments of his bones and enclosed them in lockets and amulets, wearing them against their skin when they went into battle. They believed, not as a formal religious proposition but as the folk belief of fighting men, that the bones of someone that brave could transfer some quality of courage to whoever carried them. The man they had been trying to kill for a quarter century, whose military genius they had been studying and failing to counter for a quarter century, was understood by them in death to be so thoroughly saturated with a quality they valued that his physical remains retained it after him. No Christian source made that up. It is the Ottoman chronicle tradition that preserves it. It is the testimony of the enemy. Albania passed into Ottoman hands for the next 440 years. The Albanians converted to Islam in large numbers. Not all of them, not uniformly, but substantially, particularly in the cities and among those who wanted access to Ottoman administrative positions and commercial opportunity. The dynamics of a subject population under 4 centuries of occupying rule are not difficult to understand. The faith he had died defending became, over those centuries, the minority faith in the land he had defended it in. And yet the name did not go away. It went underground, in the way that names and stories go underground under occupation, carried in folk songs and oral traditions and the memories that families pass to children, not because they are strategically useful, but because they are true, and because the truth of them matters. The Albanian highlands had never been easy to administer, and the Ottomans found them just as difficult as everyone else. They maintained a culture of memory that the empire could not fully suppress. The double-headed eagle appeared on Albanian documents and correspondence through the centuries, a symbol that had no official Ottoman sanction and that everyone who used it knew was connected to the man who had raised it above Krujë. The Albanian national awakening of the 19th century reached back for Skanderbeg with something close to inevitability. He was the only figure in Albanian history who had done what the 19th century nationalists needed to have been done. He had unified Albanian principalities under an Albanian identity. He had defended that identity against an external empire, and he had done it in a way that was documented, real, and specific enough to be argued about and built upon. The poet Naim Frashëri produced the most influential Skanderbeg text of the nationalist period, and he was himself Muslim. That is the detail that matters most. The Albanian national identity that reached back to Skanderbeg was larger than the Christian frame that Skanderbeg himself had fought within. It was about the Albanian, not about the faith. And that was possible because Skanderbeg himself, through his personal faith, did something universal: the defense of his people, his patrimony, his code. Those terms transcended the specifically Catholic diplomatic language of the Crusade. They spoke to anyone who had ever had something taken from them and chosen to take it back. The flag raised at Vlore on November 28, 1912, was the double-headed eagle on the red field, the Castrioti family banner that Skanderbeg had raised above Krujë in 1443 on the same November day. It was not a Catholic flag or an Orthodox flag or a Muslim flag. It was an Albanian flag. 469 years of continuity between the man who raised it and the nation that raised it again. That is not a metaphor. That is a specific historical fact, and the specificity of it is what makes it extraordinary. He is buried in Leza. The walls of Krujë stand on the limestone spur above the valley, partial ruins now but still standing. Still recognizably the place where the 1,500-man garrison held the walls against 100,000 for 5 months, while the man in the mountains kept the Ottoman supply lines bleeding. The museum at Krujë keeps his image. The portrait tradition began in Italy in his own lifetime and produced dozens of images across the following century, all of them showing a man with the face that European painters of the period associated with Christian heroism. Strong, composed, the eyes slightly distant in the way of a man who has spent a long time looking at far horizons. His helmet and his swords are preserved in Vienna, in the imperial armory of the Kunsthistorisches Museum. The helmet with the gilded goat's head crest, the straight sword, the curved Damascene blade, 121 centimeters long, weighing 3.2 kilograms, the weapon he carried in the mountain campaigns. The two swords were catalogued separately by the Habsburg archdukes in 1590 and 1593, placed in different halls of the collection, their connection to each other uncertain for centuries. They are together now. The helmet bears the Latin inscription that names him, Terror of the Ottomans. That is what his enemies called him, in the language of his allies, on the object his family carried out of Albania after his death. The inscription is correct. The epilogue. He died in a bed at 62, his city still standing, his flag still flying, the Ottomans still unable to say they had beaten him. 10 years later the city fell, because he was the city's real walls, and you cannot build stone from a man's will. But here is what else is true. He had been taken at 18 into the greatest military machine of his age, given its language and its faith and its doctrine, and told to become it. He had learned everything it offered, become excellent at everything it required, and held on to the thing that was actually his, the baptism, the patrimony, the blood allegiance to a people and a faith that had been planted in him before they took him east. He could have stayed. He was Sanjak Bey. He was rising. He had everything the empire offered, and it offered a great deal to a man of his ability. The comfortable choice, the survivable choice, was to stay and be what they had made him. It was the choice his brother Stanisha had made and died an old man making. He made a different choice. In the cold dark of November 1443, the choice cost him everything and gave him everything else. Consider what he gave up. The Sanjak Bey of Dibra had a salary, a household, a position in the most powerful administrative structure in the world. He had, probably, a comfortable life by the standards of the age, the status that went with the rank, the deference that went with the uniform. He was rising, which in the Ottoman system meant being genuinely useful to genuinely powerful men. In the 15th century, that was as secure a position as a man could occupy. He was, above all, alive, without having to fight for his life every season. The man who rode for Krujë in November 1443 was trading all of that for the certainty of war, the strong probability of death, and the absolute certainty of how he would die if he failed. He would die the way the empire killed apostates and traitors, with the kind of deliberate, final cruelty that Murad II had demonstrated he was capable of. He was 38 years old, and he knew exactly what he was doing. This is not the impulse of a young man who has not thought through the consequences. It is the deliberate act of someone who has been waiting, calculating, watching for the moment. He had now decided that the moment had come, and that he was prepared to pay the price regardless of the outcome. The thing that cannot be explained by pure calculation is why he was prepared to pay it. The lands were already gone. The petition for their restoration had already been refused. His brothers were already dead. There was nothing the empire could take from him that it had not already taken. In one reading, the defection was a man with nothing left to lose making the only move available to him. But that reading doesn't hold. He was risking his life. He had his life. And there were men in similar positions who had lost similar things and did not ride for Krujë in the night. The difference was the frame. He had a name for what he was doing. Not the geopolitical frame of the crusade, not the dynastic frame of recovering his father's lands, though both of those were present. It was the frame he maintained from the first day to the last, carved on his sword, signed at the bottom of his letters, declared in the cathedral at Krujë in front of God, and whatever witnesses were present, Miles Jesu Christi. The soldier of Christ is not a complicated figure. He is a man who understands that there is a commander above him and an assignment before him, and that the quality of his service is the only thing he controls. He does not control the outcome. He does not control whether the city holds or falls, whether the crusade arrives, whether Europe sends enough money. He controls the sword in his hand and the willingness to use it. The Ottomans who dug up his bones and wore them as talismans understood something that a more secular age sometimes misses. There are men whose courage is not simply the product of favorable circumstances, not simply the result of being on the winning side, not simply the expression of having enough resources and support and luck. There are men whose courage comes from somewhere else, from a decision made so deeply and so early that it does not require daily renewal, from a code so thoroughly held that no external pressure can reach the part of a man where it lives. The empire could have his service. It could have his sword arm and his tactical mind and 20 years of his life. It could not have the part that had been claimed before any sultan ever saw him. The people who wear fragments of a man's bones to make themselves brave are people who understand something at a level below theology and political theory. They understand that what that man had was real, and that it came from somewhere they cannot manufacture for themselves. You cannot train yourself into that quality. You cannot be promoted into it. You cannot buy it or inherit it. You can only hold it if it was given to you by something you did not choose. A faith you were raised in, a people you were born to, a code that was in you before you were old enough to articulate it, and then you make the decision, at the moment when the decision has to be made, to spend what you have. He spent it, 25 years of it. In the mountains of northern Albania, with 15,000 men and no reliable external support, and an empire trying to kill him, he spent the whole of what had been planted in him. He did not stop until his body stopped. The walls of Krujë stand on the limestone spur above the valley. The museum is there. The ruins of the fortress that held against Murad II and held against Mehmed II are still visible from the road. The flag he raised is the flag of the modern Albanian state. His swords are in Vienna. His name is in the central squares of Albanian cities and in the names of schools and streets and institutions across the Albanian diaspora, from Tirana to the Bronx. Such men do not appear often, and when they do not appear asking for anything. They appear asking of themselves, and the answer they give is given every day, with the sword and without ceremony, in whatever mountain passes the duty has placed them in. The battle is the Lord's. The soldier shows up. George Kestriotti Skanderbeg, 1405 to 1468, Lord of Albania, terror of the Ottomans, soldier of Jesus Christ,